All right. So first of all, thank you for staying back. I know it's very late. It's many hours after our first speaker, so thank you for staying. I'm going to talk a little bit about how blockchain can be used for sustainability. All right. And this work is actually based on some work that I've recently done, and we published a white paper together with EY. So I'm coming from the business school, so I must say that in contrast to a lot of discussions so far in the session, which focuses a bit more on cryptocurrency, my discussion is actually going to focus a little bit more on how blockchain, or as a distributed ledger technology, can actually be used to ensure and facilitate information sharing across ecosystems. And I think probably most of you are acutely aware that we are facing certain conditions as well as various climate weather events due to global warming, and that has really enhanced the attention of ourselves as well as a lot of organizations on the concept of ESG, which stands for environment, social, and governance. And in particular, because of all the extreme weather events that we are facing, as well as increasing pressure on organizations, I think there's been much more of a focus on the E side, on the environment. And here, I think there's a lot of things that blockchain can actually do to actually facilitate information sharing across the ecosystem. So clearly, to solve issues relating to climate change, to take various actions related to mitigating the effects of climate change, essentially, one of the key things that needs to happen is actually information sharing across various organizations, because this is certainly not a problem that can be solved alone. And this is where I think blockchain and distributed ledger technology, with its key characteristics of its transparency and immutability, can really play a big role. So in this research, we use a case study approach that focuses on two key use cases. One is the agricultural supply chain, and the other is the voluntary carbon markets. I'm going to talk a little bit about these two use cases and how blockchain can play a role. And very importantly, as discussed by Vitalik in his talk earlier today, right? The movement needs to be away from just purely making it work technically to really adoption and use. So the key question with adoption and use, and the key challenges with adoption and use, which I will discuss shortly, as we can see now, is actually a lot more in terms of the management and the people issues, rather than the technological issues. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we saw based on our cases, on the challenges, and also share a little bit about my thoughts about what it would take to overcome some of these challenges. All right? So first of all, let me start by a discussion on the traceability. I think traceability is talking about achieving traceability across the entire supply chain. As we know, the entire supply chain has many different stakeholders. It starts from component manufacturers to, and these component manufacturers can be of raw materials, and in the agricultural supply chain, we are actually looking at the smallholder farmers. And then there would be the various parties which would be engaged in the logistics and the carriers delivering all these parts to a factory where they would be used to convert all these components into the final products before it goes through various middlemen, like the distributors and the retailers, in order to reach the customers. So across this entire supply chain, one of the key issues that companies are facing is that they actually do not know very much about the parties and who is supplying to them beyond the one hop or at most two hops that they are interacting with. So if you're a company, it's not unusual to have a situation where you do not know beyond who are your tier 1 or at most your tier 2 suppliers. So very few individuals and companies have complete visibility across the entire supply chain. And that poses a problem because, for example, for palm oil companies, every time there's a haze, they will be getting pressured from their customers, from the public, from the regulators, to say that you should not be buying from the smallholder farmers who are burning peatland. But if they don't even know who they are sourcing from in the first place, they don't really know and they cannot prove whether they are doing so-called responsible sourcing. Secondly, I think a lot of companies are very keen to know the authenticity, the origins of the components and the products that they are sourcing from. This is important because if you are buying major parts, like for example from aircraft companies for expensive machinery, you want to know where the components are being sourced from and the authenticity of those components. Of course, if you are looking at food, right, food safety becomes a very important reason for us to create such traceability solutions. Because if you need to have various food recalls, having a traceability solution which allows you to know where your food products are coming from, allows you to do much better recall and much targeted recalls of the foods. And of course, as we talk about emissions, carbon emissions, we're definitely not there yet, but as we look at Scope 3 emissions, now Scope 3 emissions is talking about the emissions in your supply chain. We are tracking it at the firm level. It would be really very ideal if in the future we know how our products are coming about and we can calculate the Scope 3 emissions even at the product level. So all this can only be achieved if we have a traceability solution, where information is traced across the supply chain. And not only that, it even allows us to also better facilitate flow of financial information. So if we are able to better track where your tier 1 suppliers, your smallholder farmers are actually selling to, they will be able to better approach the financial companies to achieve and to obtain trade financing as a result of the better transparent information. So you can see that in this supply chain, it is a very suitable use case to use blockchain because it is a typical scenario where there's a lack of trust, there is a lack of transparency of the information, and this is where one can imagine how the blockchain can really facilitate and play a role because it can serve as so-called a single source of truth or an audit trail that is tracking the information across the supply chain. So in a very ideal implementation of a solution, it will probably look like that, where your goods that are transported from one party to another is actually tracked, hopefully in a tamper-proof manner, where the goods are individually identifiable or at least identifiable at its pallets. One can even integrate various IoT solutions. So for example, if you are tracking our vaccines, how do we know that our vaccines are actually transported at a certain temperature all the way? So if you have various IoT devices integrated with that, and the IoT devices are tracking the quality of the goods in terms of how they are being stored, how they are being handled along the way, this information can be written onto the blockchain occasionally, every so often, as it travels along the supply chain. Of course, we can also make use of smart contracts. The smart contracts can also better create automation, and the automation will allow essentially the system to be more efficient because it can automatically execute payments. It can better execute things like warranty transfers, and this would also help to make the supply chain more efficient. So of course, this is only a conceptual idea of how things can work, right? In actual fact, there's a lot of challenges which I will discuss very shortly. I think in a very similar manner, another use case is in the voluntary carbon credits market. So the voluntary carbon credits market essentially works this way, right? If you are a firm, you have declared yourself a goal to become, let's say, carbon neutral. So what you need to do is, first of all, you need to try to reduce your own carbon emissions. Of course, ideally, you want to do that not just for your own emissions, you want to also reduce the emissions for what we call the Scope 3 emissions, the emissions on your supply chain. To the extent that you can, you try to do that, but for many industries which are heavy emitters, they are likely going to find themselves in a situation where they can't. So they are still net emitters at the end of all their practices that they have put in place to actually reduce their emissions. This is when many of them will start to look at the carbon credit markets, which can be divided into the mandatory and the voluntary carbon credits market. So the idea of the carbon credits market is essentially that you have a set of project developers. These project developers are the ones who create projects that will ideally reduce the amount of carbon emissions in the world. So this can be, for example, forestry projects. You can be investing in growing trees, conserving forests. You can be investing in projects which involve direct air capture, which basically reduces the amount of carbon dioxide and pumps it into the ground, or carbon sequestration projects, or even the various renewable